Hello everyone and welcome to our class. This week we're going to be talking about learning and how that looks in your brain and maybe some methods to help us improve our learning. Learning is something we've done our entire lives, starting with our first steps and continuing as we develop new skills and knowledge. But how does this process actually work in the brain? And can understanding it help us become better learners? This handout will explore how the brain processes learning and offer ways to strengthen your ability to absorb and retain new information. As we approach this lesson, you may recognize familiar concepts from previous classes this semester. Topics like brain plasticity, sleep, physical activity, stress reduction, mindfulness, and music all play a role in how the brain adapts and forms new connections. For example, in last week's lesson on music, we explored how listening to music leads to structural changes in the brain. These are the same type of changes that occur when we learn something new. How does the brain learn on the neuronal level? So at its most basic level, learning happens when brain cells, known as neurons, communicate using electrical and chemical signals. It begins with that new experience or a piece of information which triggers an electrical impulse in a neuron. Neurons will fire those electrical signals down their axons to send a message. The impulse reaches the end of the neuron, where it releases chemicals called neurotransmitters. These chemicals travel across a small gap, called a synapse, to the next neuron. Neurotransmitters bind to receptors on the receiving neuron, triggering a new electrical signal. This process allows information to travel through the brain, forming new connections. The more often a connection is used, the stronger it becomes. Repeating an action, like when you practice a skill, reinforces those pathways. Neurons develop small growths called dendritic spines, which make it easier to retrieve information later. Over time, these strengthened connections create new behaviors and skills. And this is why practice helps you to improve at activities like reading, playing an instrument, or remembering names. Learning doesn't just change individual neurons, it also affects how different parts of the brain communicate with each other. And we'll be looking at that in just a moment. This image sort of shows us what some of those terms that we looked at earlier refer to. So in this image, the dendritic spines are represented by small branch-like structures which extend from the larger extensions of the neuron cell bodies. This is the cell body here. So the dendrites and the protrusions among them are the dendritic spines, which we mentioned previously. Dendritic spines are important because they serve as contact points for synapses, where the neurons communicate by transmitting chemical signals. The more dendritic spines a neuron has, the more connections it can make with other neurons, strengthening learning and memory. So in this image, you can see the large round structures. Those represent the cell bodies, also known as soma. The large extensions, these are where the signal travels through to the next neuron. The yellow color is showing us the myelin, which is wrapping around that axon, allowing the signal to go quicker and more efficiently. The ends of the axon with the axon terminals with their small blue dots. So the small blue dots represent the neurotransmitter release sites. And then we already talked about the dendrites up here. So that hopefully helps you understand a little bit better about the effect at the neuronal level. Now, we also have, our brain is made up of gray matter and white matter. So gray matter is about 40% of the brain, and it's the thinking part of the brain. So the gray matter contains those nerve cells, the neurons, that process and interpret information from our senses, sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell. The gray matter plays a key role in thinking, problem solving, and decision making. It controls muscle movement, which is why injuries to the gray matter can affect coordination. Gray matter appears darker and more dense than white matter, and it's mostly found in the outer layer of the brain, known as the cerebral cortex. It's also found in smaller clusters deep inside the brain, where it helps control movement and emotions. And by the way, what we are looking at here is a slice of the brain, and you can see that most of the gray matter is on the outside of the brain, but there are small clusters inside as well. Now, the white matter comprises about 60% of the brain, and that is the communication network of the brain. It consists of long nerve fibers, those axons that we looked at previous, that connect different areas of gray matter, allowing the signals to travel quickly from one part of the brain to another. White matter appears lighter in color because it's covered in a fatty substance called myelin, which gives it that pale white appearance. It's found deep inside the brain beneath the gray matter. White matter transmits information between different parts of the brain. It allows for fast and efficient communication, helping us to think, move, and respond quickly. It also helps different brain regions work together, making learning and memory stronger. So, in order to understand this, imagine gray matter as the computers in an office that process information. And then the white matter are the wires and internet connections that help those computers communicate with each other. So gray matter does the thinking, processing new information, and making decisions. It also helps us store our memories. The white matter sends the messages, speeding up the communication so different parts of the brain can work together. And this matters for learning. Learning strengthens the gray matter by building new connections between neurons. Practicing skills improve the white matter by increasing the myelin coating on the axons, making communications faster and more efficient. A healthy brain needs both, gray matter to think and white matter to keep everything running smoothly. Now, as we age, both gray and white matter can remain active through learning, social engagement, and physical activity, all helping to maintain brain function and keeping our minds sharp. When we learn something new, our brain forms tiny growths called dendritic spines on nerve cells. These spines strengthen over time, making it easier to recall information. The more we practice, the more permanent these connections become. The dendritic spines are tiny, branch-like structures that grow on the neurons. They're like little antennae that help the neurons connect and communicate with each other. When we learn something new, our brain forms more dendritic spines, strengthening our ability to remember and recall information. These spines act like mini contact points where neurons send and receive messages. The more we practice or repeat an activity, the stronger and more stable these connections become. However, if we stop using certain skills or going back and remembering certain memories, the dendritic spines will shrink or even disappear, and that's where the term use it or lose it comes in. Keeping your brain active helps maintain those important connections. Now, we did talk about myelin, which surrounds the axon and enables communication. Myelin is a fatty white substance that wraps around your nerve fibers, the axon, and it acts like insulation does on electrical wires. The coating allows the signals to travel much faster and with greater accuracy. Without myelin, brain signals would be slow and uncoordinated, making it difficult to learn and process information. Myelin is white, which is why that area of the brain is regarded as white matter. Now, why does that help with learning? Well, it wraps around the axons, forming protective layers that speed up the signals between the neurons. It prevents signal loss, so it ensures that accurate communication is going on between those brain regions. As you practice a new skill, the brain adds more myelin to the circuits involved, making learning more efficient. So some examples: musicians have more myelin and areas of the brain that control finger movements. Bilingual speakers have thicker myelin and areas involved in language, and athletes develop myelin changes in motor control areas that help with balance and coordination. Glia cells are the supporting cells of the brain. They don't send electrical signals like neurons do, but they do play a critical role in learning by controlling myelin. There's two types of glia cells involved in this process. The first are oligodendrocytes, which are the myelin makers. So they wrap the axons with myelin, forming the protective coating that speeds up signals. They respond to learning by increasing myelin in the areas of the brain being used. If an axon is frequently activated, like when you're practicing a skill, they add more myelin to improve performance. Think of them as construction workers that build myelin highways to speed up the information flow. And then we have the astrocytes. Those are the myelin managers. Astrocytes help fine-tune myelin by adjusting its thickness. They release special chemicals that can thin the myelin layer when slower transmission is needed. They also support and protect neurons, making sure that they receive enough nutrients. Astrocytes act as traffic controllers, making sure that signals travel at the right speed. Now, why is myelin and glia cells important for learning? Well, when you learn something new, the brain has to adjust the speed of information processing. It does this by strengthening the connections between the neurons and gray matter, adding or modifying myelin and white matter, and then using the glia cells to ensure that the signals travel efficiently. If the myelin is too thin, then the signals move too slowly, which can cause problems in thinking and memory. If the myelin is too thick, the signals move too fast and out of sync, which can contribute to conditions like schizophrenia. By keeping your brains active and engaged, we encourage healthy myelin production, improved learning, and memory throughout life. The brain waves are also influential in learning. The brain learns by sending electrical signals between different regions, creating rhythmic patterns known as brain waves or oscillations. These waves play a critical role in how we process, store, and retrieve information. By synchronizing activity across different parts of the brain, oscillations help us to think clearly, solve problems, and retain new knowledge. Brain waves are especially important in learning because they help connect key brain regions, such as connecting the prefrontal cortex, responsible for thinking and decision-making, and the hippocampus, the center of memory and learning. Those connections allow us to organize thoughts, recall information, and apply past experiences to new situations. They also help connect the sensory and motor areas, which coordinate movement and thought, making it easier to learn physical tasks such as playing an instrument or driving a car. During learning, brain waves adjust their frequency and synchronization to strengthen neural connections. This process helps reinforce new information and makes recall easier over time. When brainwave activity is well coordinated, learning feels smooth and efficient. However, if these waves are disrupted due to fatigue, stress, or lack of focus, learning and memory can become more difficult. Understanding how brainwaves support learning help us to see why activities like focused practice, deep thinking, and sleep are essential for strengthening memory and improving cognitive function. And speaking of sleep, sleep is essential for learning because it allows the brain to strengthen new memories and organize information. While we sleep, the brain remains active, replaying and reinforcing what we learned during the day. This process is known as memory consolidation, and it helps transfer short-term memories into long-term storage, making it easier in the future. During deep sleep, which is slow wave sleep, the hippocampus replays recent experiences, strengthening connections within the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for thinking and decision making. This replay helps solidify what we've learned, especially facts, skills, and problem-solving strategies. In REM sleep, when dreaming occurs, the brain makes deeper connections between ideas, allowing for creativity and insight. Without enough sleep, these processes are disrupted, which makes it harder to absorb new information and recall what we've learned. Prioritizing quality of sleep, especially after studying or practicing a skill, can significantly enhance learning, problem solving, and memory retention. Now, this brings us to what are the best ways to learn. And we'll intersperse this with our lesson. But basically, there's several different ways that you can learn something better. Of course, repetition is one of the first ones that come to mind. Repeating that action increases the connection between your neurons. And the more that you activate those connections, the stronger and more efficient they become. Another way to enhance learning is to use reward. So while you're practicing, try to insert some rewards in there to figure out what would motivate you to continue to practice. Now, avoid overload. So when you have a large amount of information, that will cause you to have what's known as cognitive overload. So if you're able to chunk information into small sections, that will allow your brain to process information and avoid overload. Chunking also allows for brief breaks in learning. So those breaks allow the maintenance or replacement of the receptors on the surface of the neurons. Following the break, the neurons can transmit impulses more easily. Visualize things. Visualizing learning helps to interpret the images. So if you are able to visualize what you are learning, you will become a better learner. There's also seeing the big picture. So it's nice to see the big picture before the details. Our brains hang on to what we're learning. So you might want to keep a large diagram or a page of notes which help explain the big picture. Or try something like mind mapping, which creates an image of the big picture. Teaching others. When you know that you have to teach others what you're learning, you take in new information better. We can organize it, remember it correctly, and then remember the most important parts. Learning while knowing you will teach it tends to invoke better methods for learning subconsciously. Interleaving new information. So block practice is when you study or work on something for a few hours in a row. But a unique approach to learning is called interleaving, and that mixes up the information or skills you practice. So for example, you might learn about a variety of different art techniques instead of focusing on one style, or practice a number of different tennis strokes instead of focusing on one. In this case, it's thought to play into our ability to recognize patterns and outliers. And then we can't emphasize enough how important sleep is. Sleep helps to remember concepts that you're learning. So do a little practice of reading about your new skill before going to bed or taking a nap. You can write down notes on what you remember when you wake up. Sleep deprivation can also significantly decrease the ability to learn new things by almost 40%. Our lesson focused on learning in the brain. We discussed that the brain learns through a complex process involving electrical impulses, neurons, and myelin, all working together to form and strengthen your connections. Learning occurs when neurons fire together, reinforcing their connections and making it easier to recall information. As you practice and study, gray matter grows, creating new pathways for processing and storing information. At the same time, white matter, and especially myelin, improve your brain communication by speeding up signals between different areas of the brain, allowing for faster thinking and better coordination of ideas. To enhance learning and memory, key strategies such as repetition, practice, sleep, and teaching others play a crucial role. The more we engage with new information, the stronger these brain connections become, making learning more efficient and lasting. Understanding the process of learning will motivate you to learn more things. Your result will be a healthier, more efficient brain. Thank you for listening. Look forward to seeing you in class where we'll be testing some of these methods of learning so that we can become better learners. Thank you.